I'm talking to a defense writer about a recent report that wargamed a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So how have you been, Matthew?
Good. It's been, absolutely flat out, but, we've come up on the 1 year of Ukraine. Obviously, the Russian sphere is incredibly busy at the moment, but a lot of my work's been focusing right now on Taiwan, East Asia, and a lot of the rearmament programs out there. It's been a incredibly interesting period in sort of military buildups, because we've all gone from fighting terrorist fights in Mali and Afghanistan and Iraq and buying weaponry and armory for that fight. And then Ukraine is just completely throwing everyone to the wind, going, okay, wow, tanks are really important once again. So everyone is now rushing to rebuy tanks, amphibious vehicles, and it's almost watching all of these, watching all of these militaries change on a dime, which is an incredibly tough thing to do when you're moving a very large behemoth of a department. So particularly East Asia is just ballistic at the moment, whether it be the South Koreans selling tanks now to the Polish, and they're going to be one of the main battle tanks we're likely to see in the Ukrainian front going forward, to China effectively modernizing most of their navy in the space of just under a decade, which is incredible. Either way, it's really up to the it's going to be a tense few years coming up.
Wow, man, that's a hell of an intro. So before anything else, before we jump into any of those topics, I think I called you Matthew. Chat's roasting me saying it's Michael. Okay, so can you please introduce yourself?
It's close enough. I get Matthew, I get Michael, I get Mike, I get, whatever. I just,
I'll just call you Buddy.
My direction. I'll just, Buddy, that works.
Buddy works.
I am a Canadian by citizenship, so Buddy works perfectly.
Fantastic. Well, you live in Australia, and you used to work for the Labor Party, if I'm correct. Is that true?
I did.
And you're part of the Red Line, so I can just call you Red, because you're red through and through. Perfect. So can you please explain your background, just a little bit about who you are, what type of work you've done, to people who might not be familiar with your work?
Of course. So I was a conflict journalist for many years, mostly covering the ex-Soviet states in the Middle East, reporting from trenches and front lines, working for everyone from the Times to the House of Lords in London. Now I do defense analysts and work closely with the State Department and a few other agencies, as well as the Australian government. Quite often, mostly to do with the old Russian sphere, but quite often work right now is taking you into East Asia, because defense rearmament is a huge issue, and most of what China is doing is effectively modernizing Russian equipment. So anyone who understands the Russian equipment can get a pretty good idea on where China is going with theirs. So defense posturing, working out, logistics, all that kind of stuff, which we've seen from the Russians is where all the Russian guys are now getting pulled to East Asia, because we can kind of see a playbook forming on what's coming up in the next few years.
So now you are telling me recently you've been doing a lot of work around Taiwan. Last time I was talking to you, you were more concentrated in Central Asia, post-Soviet sphere, definitely with the war in Ukraine. So you've moved over to Taiwan. Can you tell me, why are you working more in the Taiwan sphere right now when there's just so much going on in Ukraine? We're going to talk about Ukraine later, because there's just so much to talk about. But why are you working in Taiwan right now? Why are you using your focus over there?
So I'm still doing a lot of Central Asia stuff and a lot of Ukraine work and Russia work, and the Caucasus is nonsense at the moment as well. But we're putting together a big doco at the moment, effectively gaming out what a war with Taiwan looks like and the economic fallout with that, and using our friends from sort of CSIS, using our friends from DOD, then US Naval College, and helping write that report on not only war gaming out, but what happens afterwards. If there's a stalemate, what does the economy of East Asia look like after that? If there's a Chinese win, what does the economy of East Asia look like after that? Because, it seems it's been really odd. I obviously work with lots of guys from, lots of three-letter agencies. And 2 years ago, I got this, if we go to war with Taiwan, yada, yada, yada. And it seems that everyone's moved to this when we go to war with Taiwan, which is quite disconcerting.
Yes.
So now it's effectively everyone's trying to look at, not only what China has capability-wise, but also, how the logistics trains hold up, and particularly if they're following Russian models, how they hold up in amphibious invasion, which is, Russia doesn't do amphibious invasions very well. So it's a really interesting time to be looking at that.
So
because China will be using a Russia playbook.
So I just read I didn't read the entirety of the report, but I read the coverage of the report. I read the conclusions. These reports are very long, and I have a very short attention span. But I did read the conclusion of the report, and I'm thinking of the CSIS report from January that was released, that talked about how they ran the simulation 24 times, and if Japan gets involved, if Japan is an an active participant, that is something that really contributes to American success. And it looks like if the war was to happen right now or in the next 5 years, basically, which is, I guess, my main complaint about the report is just it's such a short time frame. And because most people, I think, are planning this for like 10, 20 years out. I think that's where a lot of people are picturing it. But it seems that it's saying if it was to happen right now, America and Taiwan would be favored in a direct confrontation.
Yes.
So why did it come to that conclusion? What were the main contributors? Because Japan being involved seemed to be one of the big contributors from what I read.
So the lead author of that book is actually on our show this week, and I sit down with him, and he's one of the guys helping us write this doco and report. Why they put it so soon, and usually everyone puts it at 2026, 2027, is actually incredibly important to this story. And rather than sort of calling Xi an idiot, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna anoint you as, Xi retires tomorrow, makes Dylan Burns the leader of China.
Wow.
And we'll take you through the decision-making process they're currently under.
Fantastic.
So China right now.
My first act is I want to sell more fentanyl in the United States. I want to increase that program. I want to set more. I'm thinking really long game. Okay, now you're my decision maker. You come to me. What's my next decision?
So you'll be in your nice long house, room with lots of marble.
I'm bringing back the robes. I'm bringing back robes from Imperial China. Okay, I'm wearing those. Okay, continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So your generals will be telling you, sir, we've made a huge gain in our modernization of our Navy and our Air Force. We've got a Gen 5 fighter. We are doing really well. But that's been because China has very cheap labor. They can buy a lot of stuff really easy. $1 in China is a lot more than $1 in the US. So the military is just built up at an unprecedented rate. Mm-hmm. But the trouble is that they bought all this new equipment, and by 2025, 2026, that money that they usually use to buy new ships and buy stuff is actually going to have to start getting diverted into repairing the stuff they have. So their exponential growth starts to curve like this. Whereas China is then looking at Taiwan, which it's not a budgetary problem with those guys. It's just the US giving them weapons. And by 2027, 2028, the chip problem starts really hurting, economic problems start really hurting, and the Chinese economy is a real interesting place.
Question: We see the Biden administration moving a lot right now on the chip issue. Do you think this is going to exacerbate this issue?
Oh, hugely! It's absolutely going to kick China.
Could you explain? Sorry to interrupt again, but could you explain what I'm bringing up right now with Joe Biden? Like what exactly he did?
So Joe Biden wanted a way to really hurt the Chinese without obviously throwing nuclear weapons around. Now, there are sort of microchips and semiconductors which are usually made in China or Taiwan. And these range from everything from really dumb stuff you put in your microwave to high-end stuff needed for quantum computing. Most of the market is pretty easy, and China's pretty good at making that. But this high-end stuff is really difficult and really precision to make. So what Biden did is said pretty much anything above a PS4, or PS5, sorry, gone. China, if you are a US company making that in China, you will lose your citizenship. You are not allowed to make that in China, and we are banning these from getting to China. So what it's done is effectively taken the supply of chips out from them, but also made sure that their computing is always going to be behind ours. And again, because computing grows at exponential rates, it means that every year that passes, the US is going to be further ahead in computing unless China can crack effectively the high-end technology chips that the US, Intel, and Taiwan have been doing, which so far they really haven't been able to do. So this is if we're going to look at war in sort of 27, 28, or even 26, this is something that will really bite because they can't replace really, really high-end guidance systems in some of their really nice jets. They can't replace some of their quantum computing stuff that works out, where aircraft carriers might be. It just really hurts China's war capability and blunts this whole, we want to be a really modern, really sophisticated army problem. In one stroke of a pen. Really good move by Biden to do so, and it will desperately hurt the Chinese. And this is one of the reasons we're talking 2026, because as that economy starts to get a bit weird, because as China's labor cost is growing, people are getting paid more, they're starting to get a middle class, but now they're in this weird middle ground that if their labor cost gets too high, companies go, well, I don't want to deal with China, I'm going to go set up factories in Vietnam where it's cheaper. So they actually lose business. But if labor cost stays too low, then people are going to get shitty with the government saying, well, why, I'm working just as hard. Why am I still earning less money now? And this is a real problem that all of this culminate around the sort of 26, 27. So if you're the leader of China and I'm your generals, I'm going to say, look, we have this one shot, one opportunity, to take Taiwan. Every year we do it post 26. Taiwan gets stronger, the US gets stronger, and we do not. When we start to plateau out.
So just holding it there for a moment. I haven't actually heard anybody say this before, that the idea that as the further this goes, it's not going to be that the Chinese continue military buildup is going to be harder for the Taiwanese, is that as the further this goes out, due to the lack of computing power and more American weapon sales, possibly F-16, stuff like that in the future, that's going to empower the Taiwanese to stop this. And so the Chinese are actually racing against the clock right now.
Very much so. It's a bit like a ratchet, as we pull, we're pulling more weapons into Taiwan, but we're not ever taking them out. So they're putting more and more weapons into Taiwan. So every time there's a big sort of patriotic flurry by the United States and more weapons go into Taiwan, that makes Taiwan stronger. And again, all of the war plans, particularly in that CSIS report, they all point out the horrifying notion for China that Taiwan has to be conquered within 21 days or the whole operation's a failure. And they will lose, probably around 70,000 men to do so.
Why did the report conclude that they had such a short time frame? Because we can see from Russia's invasion of Ukraine that obviously if it plans can go awry, and if that happens, it doesn't give them a lot of makeup time.
So I think the best way to do that, I'll walk you through it, and we'll walk you through the sort of decision making process, and I'll pitch it at you and see what you've done, and we'll see how close we get to effectively how this all plays out. So the first decision you'd have to make as a leader of China is whether you go to war or not. And half your team will be saying, sir, it's a suicide mission, we're going to get our asses kicked. And the other half of your team will be saying, sir, if you miss this shot at 2026, we can't ever do this again. You are you're subjecting us to another 100 years of humiliation. We will always be stuck within this first island chain. We're always going to be boxed in by the Americans.
Let's stop this for a moment. Now, if this was me, maybe they would say that. But I've heard from some circles that Xi, with so much centralized power, him being such a like a leaning figure who could, snap your fingers, make you disappear. We all saw what happened at the last Party Congress with those other Chinese officials getting kind of scooted away, humiliated in front of the whole country. Who was it again? Was it
Deng Xiaoping? No,
it was Frogface. Yeah. Frogface, right? I think it was Frogface. Yeah. Or no, it was Hu Jintao. It was Hu Jintao. He was the last. It was the last president of China.
Early in the morning.
Wow, I can't believe I remembered it was Hu Jintao. Nobody cares about Hu Jintao anyway. He was a completely uneventful leader of China. So I'm Dylan Burns. Maybe they don't have that same fear of me. Is that going to be a problem in this decision-making process?
Xi has been battered around by the military a bit more than we thought he would. So we don't know if he'll be making the decision by himself or whether you have to consult with his generals. But generally, even if that's the two voices in his head going off, that will be what his decision making is. Do you take the one opportunity where China is probably the strongest it's going to be for a little while versus letting it a pretty suicidal mission to go take Taiwan. But if it goes right, if a few things go right, then you can take Taiwan and you'll be glorious, and now you can look outside of getting boxed in by the Americans through the South China Sea. So it's a it's a roll of the dice. And that's the first decision he'll need to make.
Okay, so I guess in this scenario, let's say that I was like, okay, let's plan this out. What are my options if I decided to go ahead?
Okay, so if you go ahead, Taiwan's a bit of an oddity when it comes to geography. So there's a giant sort of mountain ridge down the side of it, and there's only 7 beaches that are usable for invasions because a lot of it's mountain, a lot of it's just this really shitty sand that the moment you drive a tank into it, it just sinks in the ground. So you have to decide north or south, and that's a whole kettle of fish, but we don't need to get too far into it. The big decision you need to make is how obviously you mobilize, because if you start ramming every amphibious soldier you have and getting them ready at the ports, you're likely to get the Americans to respond. So you have a choice of either being really prepared for this invasion and raising every alarm throughout the world.
It could be like what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Americans are just coming out and saying they're going to invade in 5 days. And everybody's probably going to take this pretty seriously, considering what happened when the United States did this last time with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
But at the time, people didn't take it seriously, and a lot of the troops.
Do you think that would change now, considering what happened in Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you go and look at sort of the build-up in Ukraine, a lot of the troops that were in Belarus, particularly, were not thinking they were going to go into Ukraine until an hour before they crossed the border. And again, what happens is, by not telling them, there's less chance of it leaking out and people going, okay, this is real, and Zelensky building up and yada yada yada. But if you don't tell them, it means that the half of tank of petrol that this soldier sold off for vodka 2 days earlier peacetime doesn't really matter. But in wartime, you're now going across the border in a tank with half a tank of petrol. Like, oof. Again, that's the trouble with, it's always a balancing between how much you want to project what you're going to do versus trying to keep secrecy. And the more secret you keep it, the less people are actually prepared for it and think it's just a drill. Again, some of these Russians walked into Ukraine with their dress uniforms because they thought it was, just a kind of training exercise, and they went in the wrong direction. Anyway, moving back to sort of Taiwan, if you want to build up, you're going to worry that you spook the Americans, and maybe the Americans make some sort of big moves or get a coalition against you or start sanctioning you early. That's a problem. But the real one you've got to worry about are 4 game plans on the table for you. One is, and this is, I'll let General Dylan decide which one he wants to take. The most peaceful one is to blockade Taiwan. Let's say there's a riot against China, which is not unusual. A couple of Chinese people get punched, and you say, I need to protect Chinese citizens living in Taiwan. We're blockading it and making sure nothing gets through. Great plan at the very start. But then what happens is the Americans go, well, that's technically an act of war. We're not really happy about it. And then 2-3 weeks later, the Americans have time to build up, prepare if they want to go to war, because that's the real problem here, and then run that blockade. And if the Americans are clever, they'll run it with a coalition of, British, Americans, Dutch, Japanese, whoever else they want. And then as China, you have a choice to either fire on that convoy and then declaring war on a whole bunch of countries, or not fire it and look completely impotent that your blockade was just run by the Americans like they didn't care.
How important, when it comes to the American response, would it be being a coalition instead of it just being unipolar America going by itself, guns blazing? How important is the alliance here?
It's huge. And, one of there are 4 things that if they don't happen, you bet 2 of those 4 things don't happen, then China actually wins this. And that's one of the big ones, is America doesn't go into this alone. So option 2 is a strike on Taiwan. And your generals will say, that's fantastic. There's less chance of bringing in Japan and the United States into the war. We're almost certain the United States will enter the war, but there's less chance of bringing Japan into it.
Wait, you're saying, okay, wait, you said something big, because when you look at American policy, officially, the United States is a big question mark on entering the war. We kind of have a very vague policy on Taiwan. Now, Biden has hinted in public that if China was to do something, we are going to war. And every time he says that, the White House reels him back in, saying, no, we didn't change anything. He's done this 3 or 4 times. I think it's more than just bumbly-o Joe Biden being bumbly-o Joe Biden. I think it's deliberate. You're saying you believe that if China was to do something, the United States would respond with military force?
I would be almost certain that they do, unless, and that's where we come to it. There's a different president in the White House. If it's Biden in the White House, he will 100% go in and defend Taiwan.
100%. That's a very confident assertion.
I would be, having spoken with members of his administration directly, I would be very certain that he goes in.
Wow.
Anyway.
Okay. Gotcha.
The next one is you just strike Taiwan, which is great. You have a chance of not bringing Japan to the war, but you also just hit Taiwan. And remember, the Americans, particularly in Guam and Japan, have all these amazing F-35s and these F-22s and all of this great aircraft that will shoot everything you've got out of the sky. And your generals will be saying, sir, we can probably get 90% of it on the ground. So we never have to fight it. If we strike them first, we can get it on the ground.
This is what the Russians tried to do in the first day or 2 of the invasion, but failed to do. This is what the
Russians tried to. But unfortunately, unlike the Ukrainians who have so many little airfields they can move around and put their troops down, the Americans don't have that luxury. Japan's real estate's not exactly cheap, and Guam is a very small island. So if you throw oodles of missiles at Guam and Japan, you can probably get about 90% of what's sitting in the Pacific while it's on the ground. And that's huge for the Chinese. And again, this is all about owning the airspace and owning Taiwan for 21 days to capture it. Because again, 21 days or you lose. That's effectively the parameters here. Then the decision goes, option C, do we strike Japan or do we strike Japan or not? And yep, if you don't strike Japan, then Japan maybe stays out of the war, but they might also let the US use their bases. And now you have a giant country with Okinawa and all these islands that is allowing American bombers to take off and strafe your cargo ships coming across and strafe your bombers coming across and strafe everything, and you can't strike back. which is not great for China.
Now, Japan is going through a period of militarization right now, remilitarization. There seems to be general support from the administration, and the population, it doesn't seem to be opposed enough to stop it. Do you think they would join the United States in a defensive mission for Taiwan? And how important is China striking them in this factor? Like, if China does not strike them, compared to if they strike them, what are the odds?
Okay, so if there's a strike on Taiwan, 50% chance Japan just joins anyway. 35% chance that they don't officially join, but they allow the Americans to actually use their bases and use Japanese lands and airspace to fight with China. And there's about a 15% chance that Japan doesn't get involved. It's pretty low. If they strike Japan, 100% chance Japan gets involved. And that's kind of the parameters that most people work with here.
So the Chinese would need to make the determination on whether they should make a bet on the very small percentage chance that Japan's just like, look, we don't want to get involved in any way. We're just going to sit here. Or that maybe they could keep them out being directly in the war, but they can be like kind of like Belarus for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, being used as a launching pad.
Yes, and that if you're back to being Xi for a moment, that's what your generals will say. So if we don't strike Japan, there's a 15% chance they stay out, but there's a 85% chance they jump into this. Plus, once we've shot our first shot and shot the missiles off, now the Americans know that we're up. They'll start scrambling their fighters across domestic and civilian airports as well, make it even harder to hit. It just makes the whole problem much harder for China. And again, it's about that 21 days. And 21 days isn't exact, but that's generally the parameters we're playing with.
Okay, so
we'll go further later on. That's when the Americans really start coming into the picture.
You're saying you keep saying 21 days, 21 days, 21 days. Explain why there's such a short time period here.
So we'll go through it a bit play by play later, but generally it's just by 21 days, the Americans are starting to effectively get together and they'll start reconquering your airspace. And then you have exponential problems from there.
So you're saying in that time period, they have enough time to arm themselves and respond?
Yes, to arm and responding and really, really bring it in. It's kind of like if you're going to rob a convenience store, do you punch the cashier and take the cash while he's a bit dazed, or do you try and grab it and hope to God he doesn't have a gun? And that's kind of a bit of an analogy of what you're looking at here. So China won't be making that call of how involved they want to get. Obviously, there's what if they strike actual Pearl Harbor or Alaska or even the US West Coast? No one thinks that's going to happen because that's too far an escalatory measure.
This kind of reminds me of Japan's strategy during World War II. Attack Pearl Harbor and just hope eventually you'll be able to take everywhere in Asia before the Americans respond. Just attack Taiwan and hope that by the time America's there, you've already taken the whole island and they can't take it back.
Mm-hmm. That's the whole point. Now, invading a island, amphibious landings are notoriously difficult to do because everything you bring ashore, you need to bring food, water, petrol, bandages, everything needs to come ashore, and it's a pain in the ass. You will lose, if the Americans can, jump into Taiwan and fight without, with Taiwan still actually half in control or some in control, we're talking casualties of 15,000. If the Americans have to go take Taiwan after China's conquered the whole thing and has set up missile defenses and moved a lot of their anti-ship missiles into Taiwan, then we're looking at 60, 80,000 casualties. It's a much, much, much higher run if China can conquer the island. And that's very much in the mind of the Americans. So if we're going with those four plans, do they make a huge strike and strike Guam, Japan, and Taiwan at once? Or do they try and keep one out? You're the general. What would you decide?
Personally, I guess I think if I was the Chinese general, if I was king of China or whatever, if I brought back the monarchy, right? I don't know, maybe I'm a Mongol plant. I think I would probably go for a direct strike on Taiwan. I mean, the blockade thing just feels like it's going to easily be defeated either through international backlash, resulting in them pushing the blockade with a coalition, with all these like trading partners making the decision like, look, even if they try to like force back our blockade, we could still respond in other ways economically, and there's a good chance we'll just back down because by that point Taiwan's prepared, they know what's coming. There's no like, oh, we're gonna get them by surprise. That could come with a fast strike. So I'd probably go with the fast strike, whether it comes to bombing American islands. Man, that'd be a very difficult choice to make, because if you bomb American islands, then you're guaranteed to go to war with the United States, and you're giving the American president no wiggle room. To go anyway. No wiggle room.
I mean, no wiggle room for the American president, but you're also not hitting any of those F-35s while on the ground. An F-35 in the air is a deadly, absolute precision machine. On the ground, it's just a very expensive car spot. And you can hit, your generals are telling them they can hit 90% of their aircraft in the Pacific in first strike. And you're having to, if you don't do it on the first strike, then they scatter their aircraft, they go to other places, they start putting up more defenses, they start hardening their positions. It's really, really difficult to get them on the ground again. You have one shot.
I'm just thinking in my mind, I'm just remembering, like, you know, Tojo sitting at the desk, like, oh, this will work. Like, it's the same. It's their same calculation. Like, I would probably back down in the situation. I feel like I would back down in this situation. But I mean, if I had to go ahead with it, you would have to go all in. But that's such a daring move, considering that, because I know how Americans are. And if under Joe Biden's administration, American soldiers were killed on American soil, not because we did anything, but because the Chinese thought we might do something in response to Taiwan, everyone would be yelling at the top of their lungs for war. Most Americans don't like China anyway right now, whether it's due to COVID and people in the Wuhan lab leak theories and stuff like that, or if it's due to just the authoritarianism they've shown in their country, or it's just due to the idea that we lost our Lord Johnstown. There's a million reasons Americans could I've already have in their head about why they don't like China, and then China bombs a trip. We would have no choice but to go to war. And in my mind, I would not want to face that type of anger of the American public actually yelling for war again right now. Because I just remember what happened after 9/11. And if America's going to war, then I'm pretty positive Japan would also be going to war. And then I also have a decent chance that Australia is also probably going to war. That also means that probably the United Kingdom is also going to war, definitely, since they're trying to, maybe.
It's a bit, United Kingdom's a bit iffier. They probably won't join this conflict. They might.
I don't think a coalition, I don't think we could beat a coalition. That's why I've always felt like the biggest risk I felt, for me personally, when it came to attacking Taiwan was under the Trump administration, because I don't think he could build a coalition. I don't think he's a good coalition builder. And that's why I think that's why I felt like Biden was better for the issue of Taiwan. I'd be too scared to pull this off if I was in Chinese leadership.
But again, we're in this, the moment you start backing off, your generals are going to tell you again, it's now or never. You know, every year that goes by, the Taiwanese and the Americans get stronger and we start to stagnate. It's now or never. So let's say you pull the trigger, and option 4 seems actually the most likely, the one where they effectively go and strike Guam, Japan.
So American soil, so just full war with the United States at this point.
Full war. Again, they are 99% certain that America will jump into a war and defend Taiwan regardless.
There's also a question here. I forgot. Somebody's brought this up in chat, and I can't believe I didn't think about this. If this is a strike on U.S. soil, doesn't this trigger Article 5?
Only if the Americans actually trigger Article 5. And that's the interesting kettle of fish that comes a bit later on, is how wide do they make this war? And technically, it's only if they declare it as an act of war. So if you're Biden, let's say it's Biden, obviously this is a completely different kettle of fish.
Okay, but they bombed and killed American soldiers. How do you not consider that an act of war?
Because they don't have to declare it an act of war. You only have to trigger Article 5 if you actually write it down and send it to NATO and say, I'm triggering Article 5. You don't have to trigger. And again, if you may not want to bring the Europeans into it, because they may not really, A, have the capability and may be too busy worrying about the European soil, and B, the guys that you really need to defend you aren't in NATO anyway. The ones that you really want on your team when this one effectively, and the guys likely to join are Japan, Australia, the US, possibly Britain, depending on how, who's in Downing Street at the time.
Do you think under the Conservatives that would happen? What about Keir Starmer? Because people are talking about him being the next prime minister.
Again, it comes down to if he's, let's say, at Downing Street and he wants to go for it. It's a possibility, but the longer you wait for NATO and your European partners, the longer you stretch that time frame out. And again, 21 days. We've hit, the missiles have hit the ground, and you've got D0 now. South Korea, they're very close with the United States, but also know that by entering this conflict, it's probably going to upset the balance with North Korea, and the United States will probably tell them it's not worth it. Plus, the South Korean economy is even closer tied to the Chinese economy than the Japanese one is. So there'll be much more hesitancy in South Korea to get involved, and the Americans probably don't need them to get involved. They'd probably just rather keep North Korea in check and keep them there, but we're going to pull most of the Americans out of where they are in South Korea to fight, to get ready and prep for Taiwan. So, now you're talking US president on how far you go with this. If you go declare what they did in the Korean War, which is effectively a police action, it's probably the smartest thing to do, because if you go and only say this war is limited to Taiwan, you don't strike the Chinese mainland, it does give Beijing an off-ramp if things start to escalate. If things go wrong, the conflict goes bad with China, they have something to fall back from. And the Americans then have a carrot and a stick to offer. Let's say the Chinese are looking really bad and they say, hey, end this war and we'll let your soldiers leave Taiwan and we won't strike anything on the mainland. So that's probably the best option. The other two is full strikes on the mainland, but then you risk nuclear escalation really quickly. Or some people talk about how successful the Ukraine model's been. Obviously sending weapons to Taiwan. Why can't we just do that? But that doesn't work for Taiwan. Ukraine is lucky that it's surrounded by, a land border
because if it's blockaded, we can't send weapons later. We would have to send those weapons now, and we're also and Josh Hawley brings this up as a criticism of aid to Ukraine, but the idea that a lot of the aid that we're sending to Ukraine is meaning that we can't send that aid over to Taiwan, because a lot of the shoulder mounted ammunition and stuff like that. Yeah. Josh Hawley talks about it. I don't know how much I take to that criticism. What do you think of that criticism?
I think the criticism was valid at the very start of the war. When we sent the first, months of war with Ukraine, we sent lots of shoulder fire cannon, lots of javelins, lots of stuff to kill tanks. And that's fantastic. It is the stuff you would need to be sending Taiwan as well. But at the time, we weren't fighting Taiwan. And again, it's about time. We can take the 2 years to replenish all the javelins we've given out. That's fine. We're not in war with Taiwan in 2 years. So Josh Hawley was... Yeah, Josh Hawley's Josh Hawley. He's going to make lots of noise. And at the time, if you only look at that specific week, yeah, I can see what he's saying. But again, he's not thinking long term. He never does. Anyway.
Not a big fan of Josh Hawley?
No, I won't say too much. I keep myself neutral. But yes, I'm not. His defense policies interesting, to say the least.
Gotcha.
So even when they've run these war games and these models, and the particular DoD, they suggest that once China goes for this strike and they effectively have... everything they throw at this. And again, the Chinese military, once you actually take into account PPP, the fact it's cheaper to make things in Taiwan, the fact that a lot of things in Chinese military expenses aren't actually included in the military budget. Stuff like R&D, which you think would be under the military budget, how to make the best missile, actually goes under technology in the Chinese budget. So when you actually start to really piece it together properly, China's budget military-wise is probably about half the Americans. And unlike America, they don't have to concentrate on the Middle East and South America and Africa and Europe and all these other places. Everything is for Taiwan. So it's almost, it's fairly certain that China can own the airspace over Taiwan in those first, 3 or 4 days. They'll throw everything at it. All their ships come out, and they have quite a lot of ships, quite a lot of good ships, and they will blockade and own. And at that point, anything we fly over to Taiwan, when they run the simulations of trying to fly 2,000 Marines in on the first day, they always lose those Marines. You can't get shipping there. You can't get equipment there in those first days. You just can't run the blockade. So again, now we're on a ticking time clock. If a US president was to bumble around and say, no, maybe we should try something Ukraine-wise, and you wait 6 days trying that and fail, you've now had 6 days of China getting men on the beaches, breaking out from the beaches and doing more before the Americans have even got themselves in gear. So it is incredibly important, as a CSIS report indicates, that you need to be striking. You need to effectively get the Americans kicking off on D0, day one of the war. Every day you waste is a day that China gets unimpeded. And it's a day that they can concentrate, rather than having all their aircraft in the middle of the Pacific stopping the Americans from getting close to Taiwan, they can concentrate them all on Taiwan himself. That's one of the major considerations here. Will the Americans declare quickly? Biden's in the White House. Yep. If it's Trump in the White House, that's a huge question mark again. And that's one of the major parameters of the problem, is we don't know who is effectively going to be pulling the trigger on the American side.
By the way, you're kind of breaking in and breaking out right now. The connection seems to be a little bad.
Sorry about that. Let me try that. How's that?
I meant connection-wise. The internet connection. Could you hang up and maybe call back?
Give me 2 seconds. I'll do it off my phone, which is stronger because it's Australia for some reason.
You sure? Okay. Oh. Well, you answered for me. I love conversations like this. Just got here. What's this? I'm talking to a defense writer about a recent report that wargamed a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Best Australian internet, true. Neat. He is neat. This is a good combo. This is a very nerdy combo. How accurate are the war games? I have no problem with them. I guess my main problem was it just felt like it only war gamed out like 5 years. Hey.
There we go. Can you see me?
Yep, I can see you.
Perfect. We're back. So, welcome to Australia, where the internet's stronger from your phone.
Fantastic. Do you remember where you were?
Pardon?
Do you remember where you were?
Oh, yes. So, we were at the point where Biden has to decide how, if it is Biden, has to decide how wide the war goes. And the best course of action seems to be a limited, almost police-style action like they ran against South Korea in the 50s of, we will fight in Taiwan, we will fight in the water, we will not fight on the Chinese mainland, because land war in Asia never goes well, as the old saying goes. You know, and to invade China or even bomb China, galvanizes the problem and takes this from what could be effectively a month-long war into, you know, we're talking years campaign.
Do you think there could possibly be some backlash from commentators saying like, look, they struck what was technically American land, American soil, because a lot of these bases are going to be like that. And now we can't strike what would be considered Chinese land, Chinese soil by the international community. I'm sure that would come with some backlash.
I'm sure that will be, you know, there will be Republicans on the other side who will criticize, but Joe Biden has always just done what's best for foreign policy. So he will just ignore them, which is probably the right thing.
He's always done what's best for foreign policy. Never a single mistake.
You've
committed to that. You've committed to that. It's too late.
There's a few in there.
It's too late. You've committed to it. Never a single mistake. Invade Iraq again.
Okay, I'm talking of this administration, not the previous ones. That's a I don't endorse those ones at all.
Gotcha.
Anyway,
okay.
So
continue.
Now we get where is my notes? Oh, there we are. So the next decision you have to make is, you know, China's, let's say, gone on the south, which seems like probably the place to go. How quickly does, you know, you want the Taiwanese government to
I do need to ask one thing about this first strike. Mm-hmm. There is some people who are scared of the idea of nuclear war. And that if technically this would be American and Chinese soldiers in direct combat, something we haven't even seen from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and something that Biden committed not to do in Ukraine, in part because we don't want to see American and Russian soldiers fighting because we're both a nuclear power. And we don't want to throw those lives into a meat grinder. And so what is the risk of that in this scenario? Because I mean, I know that we did a police-style action in Korea, but that was also before the Chinese had nuclear weapons.
Yeah, the Americans had them at the time, though, and the Chinese would have been supported by the Russians if the Americans had actually walked over the Yalu. By limiting it to effectively we are only doing this as a defense of Taiwan, we are not going any further. That does give the Chinese an out not to use nuclear weapons, and China doesn't want to. The Americans don't want to because that's the end game. You know why? You know, we're just wiping out stuff. You know, we could much easily do that ourselves. It's just not worth it. You know. By openly coming out and saying we are going to defend Taiwan and democracy, but we are not invading the Chinese mainland, it does give China an option to go, okay, this is not an existential threat to us. So they might not feel like they have to use nuclear weapons, and they likely won't, because again, once you launch one, that's kettle of that's end game, and the Americans have far more nukes than China does.
They are trying to get more nukes though, actively.
Yeah, but they're still they're going to take a long time to catch up with. You know, what the Americans have, but also how precision the Americans are. The American MERV program, which is effectively a nuke that goes in, breaks into like 8 different warheads and will hit 8 independent cities. That's pretty damn good. And the Chinese are still a bit behind on that one. So it would hurt China a lot more than it would hurt the Americans.
I know
neither side wants to go down that road.
I know Trump really wanted, when he was trying to do the new START treaty negotiations during his administration, he wanted to add the Chinese to this because of the potential for nuclear buildup. And we don't have, do we have a similar treaty with China? I don't believe we do.
No. No, we don't. But China is one of the only countries that doesn't have a first strike policy with nuclear weapons. Their nukes have always been we will strike when we get striked, because they just know they don't have, for China, they can look at there and go, do we put the money into nuclear weapons, which we're probably not going to use, or do we put them into amphibious vehicles and naval ships, which we probably will? So they haven't really prioritized their nuclear forces like the Americans or the Soviets did during the Cold War. So let's move to the next question we got. So you've taken a foothold in the south of Taiwan, and your men are starting to gain some ground, but your men are also burning through ammunition really quickly. And we also think that the Chinese army is probably going to operate a little bit worse than many people think. Again, because the Chinese haven't fought a war since the 80s. When we saw Ukraine, there's a huge difference between how well the Russians, who are conscripts and just joined the army, fight versus some of their elite crack units, particularly some of the guys from the Naval Marines or some of the guys from the Spetsnaz, are actually pretty damn good fighters. And it's because they've actually fought in Georgia, they fought in Syria, they fought.
Some of their commanding officers fought in Chechnya.
Some of their commanding officers fought in Chechnya. They know how to fight a war. They've seen blood and the nonsense of war up close, whereas most of the Chinese military hasn't. So we imagine that these first operations are going to be a bit of a cluster. The moment they've launched this huge strike, they get most of the planes on the ground, they're still going to lose somewhere around 30% of everything they have coming across the channel, because it's not D-Day. D-Day is a very short journey between England and France. It is a much longer journey coming across the Taiwanese channel, and we have satellites. The moment they leave the port, we know it's on. And
what about the risk of like a slow build up that's like disguised or something like that? I remember hearing somebody tell me about that happening, because if they did what Russia did, which was just build everything up very clearly on the border, and so everybody kind of saw from a distance that this was possible, couldn't that just give the Taiwanese time to prepare?
Yeah. So again, there's this, China will likely do the build up slowly over probably the case of a year, but there are certain things that we know won't happen until they're ready to pull the trigger. Things like when you do military exercises, you don't bring blood with you, because blood actually expires once you take it out into the field. So one of the major things, when we're looking at sort of Ukraine, if that's going to kick off, is when they were just
I did read an article about that was happening in the lead up, and that got a lot of analysts very freaked out.
That was the thing for me that really went, oh shit, this is real, because if you're doing military exercise, you don't bring blood. If you're going into a war, you bring blood with you, and because you don't want to waste all of this blood to do a military exercise. So if China starts doing the final preparation stages, effectively cleaning out the engines on their amphibious vehicles, starting to cancel leave passes, starting to cancel train schedules, things that would only happen right at the end, then the Americans go, oh, it's in, and we probably have 14 days warning that, okay, time's up, and the Americans either start mobilizing, getting their shit together that day, or hold off until the actual strike, which would be more politically palatable, because the Chinese will claim, well, we had to strike Taiwan because the Americans are mobilizing. So that's another choice that needs to be made as well. So if let's say they got on the beach, they pushed off, and they're burning through ammunition, and you have a choice to either, let's say you have a 10-day supply of ammunition and supplies for the troops there. You either get them to really, really, really push as fast as they can towards the capital, but then you're burning through ammunition and fuel much faster, so you have a 5-day supply. Or you get them to do it nice and slowly, and you've got a 20-day supply. So how fast you push is also a major question here. China will be hoping that we see a similar style invasion to Afghanistan, that when they land, the leadership flees. And that's what they hoped for with Zelensky as well.
Yeah, that's a big question I need to ask you. I was thinking about this is, what is the will to fight in Taiwan? Because the polling that I've seen indicates that they don't want to be ruled by the government of Beijing, the people in Taiwan. Of course. But because you don't want that does not mean necessarily you'd be willing to die for that. And so I do want to ask you, because from my conversations, I've gotten the indication that they would defend themselves, they would fight for it. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. They will, if things hold. So if they feel there's a victory, they actually probably will hold and do very similar style things to what Ukraine is doing at the moment. If they feel there's a defeat, so let's say that the Chinese get a good foothold and start pushing in, and then Donald Trump says, we're not invading Taiwan, I don't even know whether it is on the map, we're not doing it. That will be broadcast to the Taiwanese military, and at that point, if the Americans aren't getting involved, it's game over. And at that point, a lot of them will lay their arms down. because there will be always some partisans, but the general military will go, okay, well, shit, I don't want to be the last one holding the gun. If the president of Taiwan flees, that's also a huge, red flag to everyone that, okay, it's over, let's put our guns down, because no one wants to be the guy holding the gun when, the losses are just inevitable anyway. We saw that with Afghanistan. If the Taiwanese president stays and survives, if the Americans declare war very quickly, it will give them enough resolve and this sort of like, okay, if we can hold out for 10 days or 20 days, then the Americans come and we survive and we get to keep our independence. But it's really important to make sure they stay in the fight for 21 days until the Americans can get there. So that's, anyone else in Ukraine, if anyone else wins that election apart from Zelensky, they probably would have taken the ride out of the country and fled.
Do you really believe that anybody else would have taken the ride out? Like if it was Petro Poroshenko, do you think he would have taken the ride out? Because didn't he take the ride in and then he took the ride out again?
So that was Yanukovych who flew over to Belarus.
No. I'm talking about Petro Poroshenko during the start of the war. He came back.
Poroshenko jumped in, but he jumped out.
Yeah, he jumped out.
I hardly counted. It was almost a tourist trip more than anything.
Come on. He's my favorite oligarch. His corruption is fun.
He's my favorite oligarch.
He's my favorite corrupt person.
Again, I think Poroshenko would have probably taken the ride out. And that was really unexpected I think the Russians didn't expect the Zelensky to stay and fight either. So the Chinese may be banking that bet going, okay, it's a weak Taiwanese administration, maybe we strike and they surrender and this whole thing's over and before the Americans can even get off their ass. But that's a risk you take that, you end up having a Chinese president who holds up one of the rifles that was used during the Civil War and said, this is my grandfather's rifle. He used it to kill communists. And if they want to take it, they can take it from my cold dead hands or something of that variety. And it galvanizes the people and we have a long fight now. That's a huge worry for China. So it feels like a lot of this might be based in like China starts striking stuff, and if Joe Biden gets up there and says, we will defend Taiwan with our forces on the beaches, we will defend them, they are an ally, they are vital for American security interests, but whatever he says, he's like, we're not putting up with this Chinese malarkey, and he was like, whatever he says. That's going to be a major motivating factor for like Taiwanese generals and the Taiwanese leadership. If they see that, they're going to be like, we have a fighting chance with America behind us. If America says no, then Taiwanese democracy is dead. Yep. That is 100% right smack there. The main problem is if you're a fighter in Taiwan and I say you need to defend Taiwanese democracy, you make it 3 weeks, we win this. But if the Americans don't get involved, it's we are eventually going to lose.
Might as well be yelling banzai at that point, right?
Yeah, and at that point, Taiwan's not. Most of my IT professionals, they're not going to be like keen to fight to death if they think there's no chance of victory. And it's why that, the Ukrainian volunteer numbers were, a lot of people did join on day one, but it was day 3 or 4 that really ramped it up because at that point people went, oh shit, we could actually win this thing. We survived. Okay, we can actually win this thing. That's when people start really getting into them, really joining up and fighting for Ukraine. So
a lot of this really sounds like a combination of pulling off what the Japanese couldn't and what the Russians couldn't. Like that sounds like pretty much that sounds like a disaster just when you put in your head, oh, we should do what the Russians did and what the Japanese both did and combine it. Like that sounds like a terrible idea.
And this is the problem. This is the whole conundrum of it's so obviously a bad idea, but if you don't do it, you lose the ability to do it for another 50 years. That's what the general will always be yelling in his ear saying, you are betraying China by letting this the stars are aligned moment disappear in time.
And if they don't do it if they don't do it now in 50 years, who knows? Jesus might come back, resurrect Taiwan. Like, you don't know. Like, who knows what could happen in that time period? So, okay. Then I need to. Sorry, you have more. You have more scenarios you got to run by me. Okay.
Sorry, the next big question
is this is a deep simulation right now. I feel like by the end of this, I'm going to be speaking Mandarin. Okay, continue.
So right now, if you're China, you'd be putting all your forces out in the middle of the Pacific, trying to hold the Americans from trying to get any airspace over Taiwan. But the further you project out, the more you're going to start losing those guys to American ships firing missiles. So you have the choice to either keep them fighting there, losing planes at a really quick rate, or bring them back to just over Taiwan. But now the Americans can move their ships right into near Taiwan. And that's where things started getting interesting, because you're now contesting airspace over Taiwan. And this is where the first warning signs start kicking off for China, because you're now fighting airspace with the Americans over Taiwan. And you're losing planes at a really fast rate at this point. And now you start making decisions
how does Chinese planes perform against American planes here?
So the newest Chinese planes, the J-20s, pretty good. They're better than F-18. They're probably, I mean, they're near an F-22. They can't do the supersonic for a long, long time like the 22s can. They're not as good as a 35, but they've also got lots and lots and lots of them. And it's one of those things of, if the Americans can shoot down 3-1, well, we'll build 5-1. That's kind of the Chinese strategy at the moment.
It's the Sherman.
You can't build them. Yeah, but you can't build them quickly. That's the problem. And again, we're talking days here, and you're going to lose these things really quickly in that fight. So now your generals...
And how many pilots? Okay. It's not just about the planes, but do they have like a good supply of pilots?
There's lots of pilots, and a lot of things are computerized anyway. So you don't need... good pilots are great. They definitely build up what you can do, but it's not the end of the world if you use second-rate pilots. So now you have a problem with the first... things that come over the channel. You lose about 30% of what comes over the channel to anti-ship strikes, submarine attacks. The second run, when you go resupply those guys because they're burning through their ammunition, you're losing 50%. And the run after that, you're losing 60% and 70%. And eventually you get to a point where there's, let's say, 15,000 Chinese on the island. They go, so we desperately need ammunition and more men, otherwise we can't take Taipei. You now know that if you want to put 10,000 men on that island, you've now got to effectively take 20, 40,000 men across the channel, because you're going to lose 30,000 of them at the bottom of the sea. And now you have to make really hard decisions of, do we take all the planes we have and concentrate them to defend the cargo and defend the shipments coming across the channel, and just give up the airspace on the rest of Taiwan, which, great, you're saving the men coming across the channel, but you're also allowing the Americans now to land freely in the north of the island. And as soon as those Marine boots hit the ground, that's a real existential problem, because China's troops are going down, and the Americans will just continue to build up on the island. They also have much shorter range sorties now. They're not flying from Guam or Japan or even aircraft carriers. If the Americans can do this really slowly, and it might take 4 weeks to get out to this point, and they don't lose anything. By guesses, by most estimates, they do it in 2 weeks, but they will lose 2 aircraft carriers, which is about 9,000 US casualties, like that. That's a huge moment for the US, but it's one of those things that the safer, the longer you go, the more chance that Taipei falls. The quicker you go, the more men you lose. So there's always a balancing act there. So now if you're China, you're the general, you now know that everything you have coming across these cargo runs is losing just oodles and oodles of men. It's really you're like losing your amphibious vehicles. The men on the ground are burning through their ammunition, and you either have to tell them to make one last push with everything they've got, but if that fails, now you're stuck with a bunch of men on Taiwan with no ammunition in their guns. And they're now stuck there in poor uniforms as nothing more than poorly dressed tourists. And getting them off the island is just as dangerous as getting them on. Getting them on is just as dangerous as getting them off. So now with this, another huge problem of, okay, we've got all these men stuck on the island. They don't have the ammunition to go take Taipei. What do we do now? And that's where this 21-day problem comes in, because if they haven't taken the entire island by day 21, then the Americans can effectively start to own airspace. They start to take China down by huge numbers on their planes, and they start to put Marines on the north of the island if they've landed in the south, or south if they've landed in the north. And they can start to actually push back. And it's just, by that point, you're counting down for China. And they go, do we concede and pull back to China now while we still have an ability to fire? Or do we wait until our ammunition is just completely gone and the Americans will completely dictate the terms? Because frankly, you're not really in a position to negotiate if you have no bullets left in your gun. And that's the major problem. So China does have all these long-range missiles, and they can probably kill 2 aircraft carriers. But by the day 21, the US military, much like Japan in World War II, has started to roll back in, gain back the airspace, and that's where China is in a real rough position. So
if they were to take all of the island, let's say they were to get their success, they were to take over all of Taiwan, what could the United States do in a situation like that?
if they take the whole of the island, the US is now no longer under a real time crunch, because you're going to have to do either one of two things. A, just accept what it is, maybe bomb the island, maybe blockade it, do what you can, but otherwise they're going to have to build up for an amphibious invasion of Taiwan themselves, and the casualties go from, if they can just put the Marines on and fight the island before it falls, 15,000 is what the Americans will expect to lose. If they want to actually land, and again, it's much harder to land on the east of the island than it is on the west of the island. The western part and the north and the south is mostly where the invasion beaches are that we talked about at the start. If the Americans land, they're going to need to go into the Strait of Taiwan, which is the most hot, it's a dead zone. Land and then try and get ashore, and then you're talking somewhere between 80 to, even as high, depending on who you want to talk to, 150,000 casualties to get Taiwan back. To which the American president probably has the appetite to go defend Taiwan, lose 15,000 men, but contain China for a generation. But 100,000, that's probably a bit much for the American appetite.
So you think that would be a motivating factor for the Biden administration to respond as quickly as possible and as aggressively as possible? So you said that, like, from your conversations with Biden officials, and obviously I'm not going to pry who's who, of course, but that they have an appetite to defend Taiwan in a situation like this.
So right now they're looking at this as this. With China, if they want to project out to Indonesia or the Malacca Strait or into the Pacific or do stuff, they would have to actually bring their supply chains from China past Japan and Taiwan and all these sort of places to which we would strafe them, and it just becomes unsecure for China to do that. If China can secure Taiwan, they effectively can put all these anti-ship missiles, and rather than the defending point being sort of around Taiwan, they can now really sort of push the US back to as far out as Kiribati and the international date line. And that's really, really worrying for the US. So it is if we don't do this now, then we are going to have to fight China later whilst they have a far better position. It's much like Biden saying, if we don't cripple Russia in Ukraine now, then it's Moldova tomorrow and it might be NATO next. It's the why wait, and when we're going to have to pay 150,000 lives to solve this problem, when we can do it now quickly for 15, will be the calculation that Biden will be making, if it is Biden in the White House at that point.
What would this calculus change, do you think, under Trump administration?
Yes, it would.
How substantially?
It's always difficult to know, because Trump is, the enemy can't predict what you're going to do if you don't know what you're going to do either. And that's one of the reasons that it is, when you speak to sort of Russian defense officials with Trump, they go, yeah, like, it was odd because at least with Biden, we kind of know how the US is going to respond. With Trump, we don't know if he just goes off the deep end. He won't, follow standard conventions. So if it is a Trump, I'd say there's probably more than likelihood he goes down that same route and tries to defend Taiwan. But we don't know. If he has a crazy day, if something happens, then all bets are off the table. He might, have some money invested, which he does have some Chinese bank accounts. Effectively, he may just.
I read articles that seem to indicate he doesn't care about Taiwan at all. Where, like, he would be asked about Taiwan. The Daily Beast reported on this. He'd be asked about Taiwan, and he would be like, "Why do we have people over there? Why do we have why do we have somebody going over there to represent us? Pull them out." I got a call from Xi. He was angry about it. Blatant. Just like, I do not care about Taiwan. So it's hard for me to imagine him responding strongly in a situation like this, unless his honor was called into question, I would imagine.
He may get railroaded by some of the Joint Chiefs, and that happened quite a lot. So particularly, there was a famous story where the US were deciding on what to do Syria policy-wise, and at the same time they did that, they got Trump to design the new colors for Air Force One while they made that decision. So we may see something down that road with the Joint Chief. That's very true.
That's very funny.
Whilst they were deciding Syria policy, they got Trump to do the Air Force One color scheme, which is pretty funny. So if it is Trump, he might get railroaded by the Joint Chiefs. We don't know, but obviously it's a much harder thing to predict when it's Trump in the White House. DeSantis, I think he goes in. I think he listens to the Joint Chiefs. Biden, 100%. That man thinks in 30-year terms because he's lived like 130-year terms. But he will be thinking about, if we don't do this now, we can lose 15,000 now, or 30, or 80, 100,000 in 6 months, or we can lose far more than that when we're fighting them in the second or third island chains.
So I want to ask, let's say this goes the way that the simulation said it was most likely to go, which is U.S. success, Japanese success, Australian success, Taiwanese success. How does everybody look afterwards? How does the Navy of the Chinese look? How does America's Navy look? How does it look?
So this is a really interesting kettle of fish now, because if it's really short, companies that are in China may decide to stay. They may do what they've done with Russia, where 95 or 92, depending on who you ask, of companies that said they were leaving Russia just changed their coloring scheme. McDonald's didn't actually leave Russia; they just repainted everything green and called it fresh and tasty. And they don't sell a Big Mac; they sell a Bolshoi Mac, which translates to Big Mac. They might do that if it's a really short war. Generally, though, we are going to probably see huge sanctions from the EU against China. We're likely to see, absolute backlash from the international community, because we've seen from Ukraine that when you try and change borders by force, people do tend to respond.
I guess, but here's the question I have. Ukraine is not as internationally isolated as Taiwan is. China has worked over the years through, I forget exactly what the strategy is called, but they have worked to isolate Taiwan, is to make them not have formal embassies, not be formally recognized. Is that going to undercut an international response if the international community doesn't have as much formal ties with Taiwan? And China's a huge country, got a big money, of course, big money in China.
It's a huge country, but everyone's going to have to disrupt their supply chains regardless, because the US will declare the East China Sea or through Taiwan Strait as a free fire zone. So all of the stuff coming out of China is going to stop for whatever the period of the war is anyway. Which, if businesses can go 4 weeks without China in their supply chain, then you start to think, we need to start thinking about where else to set up, which is a nice little conundrum for those guys to solve. If they sanctions will go from the EU. We can almost be certain of that. There already are EU working groups that do work and game that out. The democracies will likely think the same. Russia will just stay neutral. They don't really want to get involved in this nonsense. They'll continue to sell their oil to who they can. But it'll also scare a lot of the ASEAN nations. Your Vietnams, your Cambodias. Not Cambodia. They're probably
Philippines.
They're probably fine, but Philippines is a big one because it's an aggressive China. And
Duterte's response to China was, it did not go well.
Yeah, Duterte was quite pro-China, or more just anti-American more than anything. But it's now Marcos Jr. who's in charge in the Philippines.
And he's renewed the bases.
He's renewed the bases. His father was the very, very pro-West, dictator of the country who stole so much from the country. It's not even funny. His plane barely took off as he fled the first time because it had so much gold in it. Those guys know that if Taiwan falls, they're next on the menu. It's the same reason that Moldova, pre-February invasion, was probably a bit ambivalent about Ukraine. After Ukraine gets invaded, they're 100% okay. Yeah, let's talk. Ukraine needs to hold, because they know that if Ukraine was to fall and fall quickly, Moldova is next on the menu.
And we can see from the recent leaks that seems to be the case, that the Russians might actually be planning a coup in Moldova. We've seen that they might be. There seems to be reports that's what the Moldovan government's saying, that's what Ukrainian intelligence is trying to say. And whether or not we know they're trying to do a physical coup, there is over 1,800 Russian soldiers in Moldovan territory. We saw Lukashenko's weird showing of the map of using those troops from Transnistria to invade Ukraine. We know that Russia has tried to foment corruption in Ukraine, and we have seen what looked like false flag attacks in Transnistria earlier last year, which seemed like a way to get Russia involved in Transnistria and try to bring that into the war. It feels Russia, there is activity going on there, almost certainly.
Having spent quite a bit of time in Transnistria over the years, there's no chance that moves. The 14th Guards Army is who's currently in Transnistria. They're not particularly well equipped. Most of they've been sitting there for quite a while. They got enough that if Moldova was to throw a punch, they could probably fight Moldova off for a little while, but they also can't be supplied. Even if they push the tanks over the Dniester River into Moldova, great. They get halfway through the country and the tanks are out of petrol and out of shells and out of ammunition. There is a good stockpile sitting in Tiraspol, but not enough for a long campaign. And the Russians can't supply them because they're currently fighting a war in Ukraine. The other interesting with Transnistria is that all of the power for Moldova, the power grids, the power stations, are all based in Transnistria. And Putin has kept it artificially cheap for the Moldovans, so that he has a lever that whenever the Moldovans act up, they push up that lever. The protests we did see in Moldova were on the day where there's been the pro-Russia protests in lots and lots of countries that same day. The current prime minister or president of Moldova is the popularity is waning a bit, and this was a great way to boost her popularity. There was talk that this was sort of a FSB plot, but it looks like it's a low-level one that probably didn't have that much effort or planning going into it. So it's a story.
So you're saying that the FSB, you say the FSB Russian coup plot was either low-level or there's not really much to it.
Yeah, I don't think it's not a huge story. I think it's a they'll have these protests that they know are going to kick off anyway, and someone says, hey, we bring in a couple of ruffians, maybe something happens, it's going to cost us a couple of $1,000s to do it, and some guy went, yeah, sure, why not, to push that out. And effectively the particularly the Moldovans are making hay out of it, because by showing that they're fighting back against this, the president's actually quite popular.
Yeah, usually that's not a lot, but people have spent thousands of hours on the internet arguing that's what the FBI did on January 6th, okay? So for a lot of people, that type of stuff matters, okay? But I guess so when it comes to, I want to bring it back to Taiwan before we move over to like Moldova and these other topics. So this is a very interesting study. I mean, very interesting simulation, because I don't think we've had something like this done publicly. I'm sure there have been war games done, but the results are not always shared, because obviously the government does not want the opposing side to know all this information. My question to you is, after looking at all this information, after being directly involved in accumulating this information yourself, what do you think are the odds that the Chinese push the button on this?
I think it's very low the Chinese push the button, because it's the end of everything, and it's not, is Taiwan worth it? Probably not. And if Biden goes into this declaring that this is just about Taiwan and the Strait, that's it. We're not striking the mainland. It gives China that off-ramp, that he knows that if there's 30,000 troops stuck in Taiwan who are running out of ammunition and it's too expensive to get stuff across to them now, there is an off-ramp. There is okay, I can bring these troops home and I don't lose them all, and we don't lose, have all our ports struck across the east coast of China. Okay, yep. That's the road we take. And even if it's not, even if he doesn't want to do it, he will probably have a lot of his generals or a lot of particularly government ministers who will likely be, do it or we're going to give you a coup. And that's a really important thing, is to allow an off-ramp for China to pull back. So do they push the button? Probably not, because it's suicide to do that. And China's, if they have an off-ramp, if they think they can get out of it without pushing a button, they probably will.
But it feels like your conclusion also was, if they are going to push the button, they're going to push it in the next 5 to 8 years. It seemed like, from what you were saying.
I'm talking about a nuclear button here. If we're talking about an invasion,
no, I meant an invasion button. That's what I meant. That's what I meant.
Sorry,
I meant the button on invasion.
Okay.
No,
I'm talking nuclear strikes. So
no, I was talking a button on invasion.
The English language is a wonderful thing. I'd say it's 40-60 they go through this, because I think they've probably run the same simulations again and again and again, and gone, wow, we really are in a rough position to take this. Invading islands is always a painful exercise to do. Yeah, effectively there are 4 things that if they go wrong, they actually have a chance of winning. 1, the Americans don't get involved. 2, that Taiwan surrenders early or has a government that will capitulate early. 3, that Japan doesn't get involved. Or 4, that the Americans don't supply Taiwan with anti-ship missiles.
All of those things don't seem particularly likely from your analysis today.
They don't seem particularly likely. But if, let's say, an American election goes the wrong way and a Japanese election goes the wrong way, and there's civil unrest in Taiwan, then China might go and make those calculations. Well, there's a risk. It's the same thing that, Putin probably made going into Ukraine, going, okay, we think that Zelensky might fall. There's, 50-50 chance that happens. And maybe they surrender like they did in 2014. Yeah, it's okay. And I haven't been out to check the army in a long time, because I've been in my bunker with, avoiding COVID, but the army should be strong enough to go take Ukraine. All 3 of those would have to go wrong to lose in Ukraine. If you're playing with the wrong set of cards, which Putin probably was, that seems like a reasonable bet to take. Whereas China, they might be playing with the wrong set of cards too. They might think Taiwan's weaker than they are. They might think the Americans don't have the resolve. Maybe there's just been another huge incident inside America, and people are too focused on that to worry about Taiwan. Maybe Japan's got a new prime minister who's an anti-war person. If those things line up, China will maybe roll the dice. But if all those four things seem like they're in place, the chance that China actually wins this is incredibly low.
I guess there is also a question to be asked. Like, much of the analysis leading into the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was under the idea of assuming that like they wouldn't do that. That would be crazy. That seemed to be a lot of the analysis. Like, that wouldn't make sense. It'd probably go terribly for them. Why would they ever do that? And then they did it. And so I guess there's a question I need to ask you, where I think the Russians didn't realize how unprepared they were or how much resistance they were going to get. Does that same delusion exist in the heads of Chinese leaders, where they have been told by possibly people in Taiwan that, oh, the people would welcome you here. People love Xi here. They call him Winnie the Pooh out of like, it's kind of like, it's like a term of endearment, Mr. Xi. And what if they start telling them that? Like, could that be a problem? Because we do know that pro-Russian oligarchs in Ukraine was telling Putin that, like, hey, things look good here, but there'll be no problem. And that was part of the reason why he failed.
Hugely. And this is one of the problems. Once Putin has surrounded himself with only a few people he trusts, particularly guys like Prashutyev, who security services, he'll trust his stuff over what comes out of the Foreign Office because he likes him better than anyone from the Foreign Office. That's the trouble, that if Xi continues to consolidate, it may just be a one-man decision. And this is the difference between sort of US and, Russian or Chinese, military styling. The US, when they make decisions, it's usually a bunch of Joint Chiefs sitting around a desk. So you kind of actually can predict what the US is going to do because it's a group that decides. We know how they generally think. They generally follow US conventions and doctrines. It's actually, they, generally go down a consensus middle of the road. When it's Xi or when it's Putin, it is really difficult to know how much influence they have. So when, for instance, Blinken was going and meeting with guys like Lavrov before the war, saying, hey, we know what you're going to do. And from what Blinken tells us, Lavrov seemed to think that it almost like looked like he caught Lavrov off guard. Like Lavrov didn't know what was coming off either, because it seems from all the accounts
we saw so many.
Pretty close to the chest.
Felt like every single ambassador was saying it the day before, "There's no invasion. There's no invasion." And I don't know how much of that is like planned trickery or how much of that. And I think more of it's probably they legitimately did not know it was going to happen.
So there's two things. One, they didn't tell a lot of people. Again, a lot of the troops that particularly crossed in from Belarus didn't know they were going to go into Ukraine until an hour beforehand, because they actually kept it quite quiet. And two, there's a lot of analysts, and myself included, who looked at it and went, okay, I'm seeing the math and this ticks all the boxes for an invasion, but surely they're not that dumb. Putin can't be that. Surely he knows it's not 2014. And we just kind of like sat there looking at our screens going, surely he's not that dumb. And then when he crosses, we go, holy shit, he is that dumb. Again, because he made that calculation, we think Zelensky will capitulate. We think that we can take Borisopol Airport really quick, or Homostel Airport really quickly. We think that we can, that 2014 will happen again and everything's disorganized. And we think that we've mobilized enough troops and that our tanks are all in great order. If all four of those bets were correct by Russia, they probably would have won. But all four of those bets went wrong. And for China, if they're putting the same bets on, that Taiwan will capitulate, that the US won't get involved, that Japan won't get involved, and that there aren't a bunch of Harpoon missiles sitting in bunkers somewhere in Taiwan, and then they get all four of those bets wrong, then they lose. So it comes down to, is Xi getting good information, or is he getting the information he wants to hear? If he's getting information he wants to hear, he may think that those are good bets. If he's getting real information, he'll know they're bad bets and he won't go in. Because it's, if...
Which way do you lean?
I lean that he's probably getting decent information at the moment, but he is getting more and more centralized. And as the Chinese economy continues to worsen, there's a really dark clouds in the sort of very early horizon at the moment. Xi has consolidated so much power. Rather than what they used to do is have sort of a committee of people who made decisions. So if anything went wrong in China, they'd say, well, it wasn't Xi's fault, it was the committee's fault. It's these 11 men. You can't really blame anyone. So everyone can get away with a little bit. But now that Xi's consolidated and it really is kind of just him, anything goes wrong, particularly economic-wise, it's all on Xi. And that really panics him.
We have seen the Russians, though, use people like Shoigu almost like a scapegoat, that if anything goes wrong, when you see Russian soldiers recording these videos like, Hello, comrades at home. We've run out of underwear. Please send more. Putin, if you knew of our underwearless situation, you surely wouldn't have sent us out there. And they never blame Putin. It's always Shoigu. And why could they not do the same thing in China?
So Shoigu was, Shoigu's a really interesting character, and I don't have too much time to talk about Shoigu today. But generally, he came out from, as a good administrator. He took the Department of Emergency Acts, which is a notoriously corrupt department, and actually made it work. So when there were bushfires or forest fires in Russia, they actually worked really well. He then becomes governor in Moscow, and he actually runs that really well. He's a really good administrator. He can kind of thread the needles between the tax guys and the defense guys. And then he gets put in the army, he does do some good reforms, and everyone kind of went, wow, he's a really good administrator. In fact, most people picked him to be Putin's next successor. Then the war kicks off, and there's sort of a lot of stuff starts coming out that Shoigu was the dissenting voice, that in the closed door meeting, Shoigu was saying, don't do this, we will lose, it will be awful, don't do it. But when he was railroaded, he went, I take the orders from my president, I will carry out the orders from my president. They want to shut that shit down, because if there's anyone in that oligarchy or upper circle that they think could possibly take over, boom, that's a real threat to Putin. So there's a lot of propaganda on both sides, with pro-Shoigu guys going, he was the dissenting voice, and there's a lot of guys on the Putin side saying, no, he wasn't, he's just as guilty, no one can take my place, it's me or anarchy, that's the only options. So that's where we usually sit with Shoigu stuff.
Man, I feel like I have a Shoigu question here. Quick deviation before my last one. Could there be a Shoiguist Russia? If Shoigu took over, how do you think he would handle Ukraine? If Putin died tomorrow, who would replace him?
So if Putin, there's a few guys who, I can only pull up my...
And to be clear for everybody listening, Putin's now 70 years old. He looks sickly. He's gripping every table he's near. I'm not saying we don't know anything for sure, but people are speculating. And when you get up to that age, that's a question that needs to be asked.
So most of the oligarchs and most of the rich people in Russia have effectively got their riches by being corrupt with Putin. So if Putin dies, they will want someone in the Putin circle to take over, because they won't prosecute them for crimes. So it's probably going to be someone from the Siloviki, which has got a Putin's real inner circle. Looking at Shoigu was obviously the choice. I don't think he's probably got it now. I know he's been beefing with some of the oil companies, particularly. Then the next choice is Igor Sechin, who's the head of Rosneft. Very, very rich man, used to be Putin's chief of staff many years ago, has the political money to go run a campaign properly. Possible. He's not really liked by a lot of oligarchs, though. Alexander Bortnikov, who's the head of the FSB, probably next in line. But that would effectively turn the country into a giant police state, even more than it is now. And it would be real rough. Bortnikov's the least charismatic man I've ever met in my life. Nikolai Patrushev from the Security Council is the other choice. Cunning guy, really knows what he's doing, very connected with sort of the, he knows where all the bodies are buried, is probably the better way to put that. Again, he's also very old and not a particularly good guy when it comes to politics. He's also a absolute hawk. He would probably be calling for strikes on Ukrainian nuclear power stations, and absolutely taking this to the next level. After that, Sergei Ivanov, who's a special representative to the president, effectively what chief of staff is. He's a possibility, but he's probably a bit young and inexperienced, and I think the oligarchs would railroad him. Otherwise, Sergei Nashytyev, who's the director of Foreign Intelligence Service. This is a guy who, the West would probably be a bit happier with, because he does think more foreign policy, but it wouldn't be a huge deviation from, where Russia is at the moment. Those are your top 6 on who would be the most likely to take it. Otherwise, you've got, Vyacheslav Volodin, who's the chairman of the State Duma, effectively a prime minister-y kind of guy. He's very well connected. He's very good with Russian politics. Doesn't have enough ins with the energy sectors.
Okay, so now that you've got a lot of names there, but obviously you can't go through all of them. So just go through like I just want to know Shoigu, right? If Shoigu became a leader of Russia, how do you think he would continue? Do you think he would continue the war? Do you think he would come immediately to negotiating table? Be like, look, this was a terrible mistake. We're withdrawn. How do you think he would react? This is separate from Taiwan. I'm going to bring it back to Taiwan and wrap it up, but I'm just interested.
But Shoigu would probably go down the road of what a lot of the Russian, particularly sort of some of the Gerasimov staff, who's the head of the army at the moment, have been calling for, which is right now they're anchored across the Dnieper River in the south. Ukraine can't cross that river. It's just crossing rivers is just an awful mess. Because when you get your tanks across the river, you've now formed a beachhead that can be attacked, and you can't supply those guys. So if they can effectively hold the south and they can push up from out of Bakhmut and take some of those rivers and hold on the rivers, and then possibly push up a little bit further from, towards Zaporizhia, they can find a few rivers and natural barriers there and possibly call for some sort of a ceasefire, in which case we end up with Transnistria, which Transnistria is still technically at war with Moldova. But, it's no one's fired a shot in years. Moldova, the Transnistrians kind of go into Moldova, do their shopping, go back to Transnistria, and vice versa, depending on what you want to buy. It effectively operates like two separate countries, but technically they're at war. And that's Shoigu would probably go for that option as we're not technically surrendering to the Ukrainians, but we're going to hold here and we're, digging in. And if the Ukrainians want to go and try and take it back, it's a very bloody exercise to go take that back, because they're going to have mostly be crossing rivers or defensive positions. We end up with a stalemate, effectively.
How likely would that even be? Because they would still have to take a lot of ground to be able to pull this off, I still think.
Not really. They don't need to take too much extra ground. The big fighting in the east, but you push up a little bit further on that sort of, as the front line curves up north of Melitopol. But it's not too much extra ground to take. And again, Russia's got a lot of extra men now from their recent recruitment drive. Mm-hmm. You could probably do it. And once you call a stalemate, you effectively can sit there for 8-9 years, rebuild the Russian army, and try again in 8 years. We know the French have been making some calls, particularly Macron has been making calls to Zelensky this week saying start to think about a peace deal, which is worrying for the Ukrainians. So if Shoigu, he's probably going to push that a bit further, go for a nice little defensive position he can sit in where Ukrainians are going to have to throw 5-1 to break through those points. And the Ukrainians are going, well, it's 5-1. It's a lot of men. They're not recruiting as well as they were. I know the latest recruitment drive from Ukraine was not nearly as successful as they were hoping. Again, because almost everyone who's fighting is already fighting. So that's, if Shoigu's in power play, that's, I'd say, what his play is, that he tries and finds a defensive spot and lets it stalemate and builds up for 8 years from now. Again, he's a good administrator, but bold is not his forte.
Gotcha. Okay. I want to ask you more about this, but I also want to make sure you have an opportunity to leave. How much time do I have you for?
I've got about another 15 minutes and I got to get going.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you this last question about Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Do you think the ending of the war in Ukraine will have a legitimate effect on whether China makes a decision to pull trigger on Taiwan? A lot of people have suggested it. I'm somewhat skeptical of it. I do think that the strength of a Western alliance could, make them rethink whether or not they would do this type of invasion. I do think the performance of Western weapons could also make them rethink something like that. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how sure I am of that. So what do you think?
I think you're right. I mean, if you'd told me that NATO was going to be the most united it's ever been 2 years ago, I would have laughed at you. If you told me that I would be in Australia seeing bumper stickers that say Slava Ukrainia, I would have laughed at you. And that's as someone who covers that sphere quite a lot. I used to spend most of my time in that sphere. I just didn't think the West could be this united, particularly coming off, really divisive European politics. So, China will be looking at that and going, holy shit, like that could happen to me. They actually might unite. The West is more united than it's been. And as we're seeing with a lot of the Chinese pullouts from some of their BRI, their Belt and Road projects, they're not having the cultural impact that they think they do. When they stop paying guys like Zambia immediately kicks them out because they're not having that real deep cultural cross-pollination that they were hoping for. And when you hear Chinese diplomats particularly, I remember one of them saying a few years ago, how the F is this, he's talking about Psy doing Gangnam Style, how the F is this pop star having more outreach than our entire foreign policy budget. What is going on? Because they're just, when you go to even really close countries, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, those sort of countries, and you ask them, hey, how do you feel about China building this huge highway for you? The first thing they'll say is, well, they're building it because it's strong enough to take the tanks to invade us. They don't trust them. I was just in Tajikistan and Afghanistan about 3 weeks ago, and speaking to Tajiks there about what their opinions on China is. They go, oh, they come over here and they take our women while we're off working and rah, 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 and disdain of China. But when you actually go and speak to the Chinese embassy in Dushanbe and they say, yeah, we've registered like 50 marriages over the last 5 years, it just doesn't happen. but there's still that resentment against China. So they're already watching where they pull out and they stop paying bills. They're not having this love of China that they thought they would, or a cultural impact that, you know, a Russia or someone else has had over the years. So yeah, I would be if I'm China, I would have watched Ukraine and a united West and gone, shit, that's what I'm up against. I'm not up against a ragtag bunch of, you know, infighting guys like the US going into Iraq. I'm fighting a fairly united front, which is terrifying for Beijing.
I think the main thing I would be rethinking would honestly be the will to fight, because a lot of people, I mean, the narratives about Taiwanese and Ukraine, while there is obvious cultural and historical differences, a lot of the argument was like, look, they're not going to have a will to fight because they're all basically Russians anyway, and so when the Russians come in, they're all going to be like, oh, we're basically Russians, thank you for liberating us. And when you hear about Chinese nationalists talk about Taiwan, they completely disregard the idea that there's a burgeoning Taiwanese identity among young people. They completely disregard that. They say, look, they're basically Chinese anyway, so when the Chinese walk in, they're just going to accept it. I mean, it sounds pretty similar, even if there are clear historical differences.
And again, if you'd had this conversation in 1970, I probably would have agreed with you. You know, agreed with that statement. You know, that there wasn't this real deep Taiwanese identity. These days, there is. There is 100% a deep Taiwanese identity. Yeah, and particularly with the younger generation, and that's something that China, you know, most good generals, most good analysts will see. But if you're, you know, a sycophant who's telling the president what he wants to hear, well, maybe you don't know that. And maybe you are expecting them to lay down the arms like Ukraine did in 2014, which they won't, unless the US say they're not going to get involved in the war, then, and it looks hopeless and the president's left. Then they might lay down their arms, but not of love for China, but apathy and not wanting to die. Yeah, if there's any will to fight and there's any hope of them actually winning the war, that Taiwan will fight to the end.
Okay, man. Every time I have you on, I think, God, I gotta have him on more. Every single time I have you on. So
well, it's always good to be on.
I want to get through a few quick questions because I just need to ask you about Ukraine, because I'm going back to Ukraine, flying out March 4th, so I'm flying out in a few days.
Fantastic.
Going back over there, I'm going to be filming with IED crews, so
yep.
I'm excited to get back into that work. And so I wanted to ask you a few questions. So the first question I have to ask you is, the first stream we ever did, we both were very reserved on how Ukraine would perform. Since that original point, how do you reflect 1 year after the war started on how Ukraine has performed compared to your original analysis before the war started in those early days?
Again, I took the line that most of the State Department had, which was Ukraine would fight well, but if there's no central government there, then it becomes an insurgency rather than a concentrated front line. And the Ukrainians are punched way above their weight. They've been given great weapons and they run with it, and their morale's strong. You know, it was amazing to see in those first days with people immediately making Molotov cocktails. So Ukraine has punched way above its weight on this one.
Now that the war is a year, has gone on for a year, what do you expect with these spring offensives that everybody are talking about? The people are saying the winter offensive is already underway. The winter because winter's ending, and you know we saw what's happening in Voldar and Bakhmut and all these locations. What can we expect to see with these spring offensives coming?
Bakhmut is likely to be surrounded, and the Ukrainians will likely push away from Bakhmut, and the fight then comes to Krasny Yarsk and a few other areas. Whether the Russians try and secure the sort of Shogu plan, that's up for grabs. I think it's still pretty hard to tell at the moment, but you know,
would they need to capture locations? They're going to still need to capture places like Kramatorsk, right? In order to
they'll need to get Kramatorsk.
That's going to be very difficult, man. I went to Kramatorsk. That place is
a really difficult option to take.
Oh my God! When I was there 7 months ago. They were digging trenches still, and that's been reinforced after 8 years of war.
But there's 150,000 Russian troops about to hit the field, and that's worrying a lot of people. But generally, yep. Yeah, I've actually got to go. I've already got my producer bringing me and telling me I got to be somewhere.
I'm sorry.
Again, it's been absolutely fantastic. Jump on this one anytime you want me to jump on and talk geopolitics. Always happy to jump back on.
Awesome. You have a good one. See you later, man. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.